opens lines for bishops and queen, immediately fighting for central space and setting an active tone. Immediately contests the center, mirroring white's ambition and setting the stage for dynamic piece play. Establishing central control and threatening the enemy pawn are key objectives here, setting the stage for rapid development. Developing a knight to defend the central pawn establishes solid control and prepares for rapid queenside expansion. Unleashing the Lopez, white immediately pressures black's central pawn and begins a sophisticated positional dance, aiming to subtly control key squares. Targeting the e4 pawn directly, this knight jump immediately challenges white's center and opens lines for rapid development. Paving a path for the bishop, this quiet maneuver prepares to support the center and offers a modest, yet solid defensive structure against black's rapid development. Knight's development now looks slightly less natural, potentially inviting pressure along the c5 diagonal. Exchanging knights here simplifies the position, aiming for a slight pawn structure advantage and potentially more active pieces. Doubling pawns on the c-file concedes a structural weakness in exchange for development, potentially opening lines later. Developing the knight to d2 subtly reinforces the e4 pawn and prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially f1 then g3, aiming to support the kingside advance or join the central struggle. Developing the bishop to exert pressure on white's d-pawn, this repositions a piece that was previously blocked, setting the stage for potential pawn breaks and a more active central presence, while also preparing for castling. Shifting that knight to b3 is a clever way to gain an outpost on c5, potentially pressuring black's weakened queenside pawn structure and the isolated c-pawn if it ever moves. Reorganizing the bishop to this square aims to solidify the pawn chain and prepare for potential central breaks or kingside action, though it momentarily blocks the d-pawn's advance. A bold maneuver, relocating the knight to the edge of the board, aiming to pry open the queenside by threatening the bishop and forcing structural concessions. Asserting control over the b-file, black prepares to challenge white's knight on a5 and potentially open lines for their pieces, creating dynamic counterplay. Unifying the rooks and preparing for potential action along the central files, this queen repositioning subtly strengthens white's coordination while eyeing potential weaknesses that might arise. Black immediately challenges white's knight and aims to disrupt the pawn structure, potentially opening lines for piece activity on the queenside. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this piece now eyes the queenside and aims to support a potential kingside advance, while also preparing to connect the rooks for future operations. Securing the king behind a pawn wall is a prudent defensive measure, creating a safe haven and preparing for potential future operations. Solidifying the kingside and preventing any immediate kingside pawn thrusts from black's potential future plans. Black's queen repositions, eyeing the queenside and preparing to potentially challenge white's slightly awkward knight on a5. This maneuver subtly alters the pawn structure's dynamic, hinting at a desire to break white's control over the central dark squares and perhaps launch an assault on the b2 pawn. Observe how the queen's relocation, while seemingly passive, aims to enhance piece coordination for a future queenside initiative, potentially exploiting the long diagonal opened by the prior bishop exchange. Consider the positional implications. The queen's presence near the edge of the board might seem counterintuitive, but it serves a specific purpose in this unfolding middle game scenario. Notice the tactical geometry. This queen movement creates a latent threat, forcing white to remain vigilant about potential incursions and pawn pushes on the queen side. Pressing the knight towards the king side, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened light squares after the early exchange on c6, creating a subtle positional squeeze. Seeking to connect the rooks and activate the queen side, black repositions the knight to d7, preparing for a potential advance on the c-file and solidifying the central presence. This maneuver subtly aims to improve the knight's scope while avoiding the restrictive influence of white's knight on a5 and looking towards a more balanced pawn structure. Fortifying the king's sanctuary before further operations on the queen side, opens up avenues for piece repositioning and prepares for potential pawn advances, aiming to wrest control of the central squares and liberate the bishop currently hemmed in on d2. Black gambles for space on the queen side, aiming to shatter white's kingside castling advantage and potentially open lines for their rook. However, this aggressive pawn thrust weakens the queenside pawn structure and might create tactical targets for white if the center remains solid. The knight's repositioning to e3 shores up the central tension and prepares a potential kingside advance, even if currently there's no immediate threat. This knight's journey, having ping-ponged from b1 to a5 and now to e3, hints at a subtle shift in white's grand plan. It's no longer about aggressive pawn grabs on the queenside, but a more measured build-up, perhaps aiming for control of the d5 square or even a later kingside sortie. The quiet coordination of white's pieces is beginning to take shape. The knight on e3 supports the pawn on d3 and eyes the f5 square, a potential pivot point for future operations. Black's pawn chain on the queen side has created a distinct structural imbalance, and white's knight maneuvers seem to be acknowledging this, opting for solid development rather than immediate confrontation. This repositioning might also be a defensive maneuver, anticipating black's desire to push the c-pawn further and creating a more robust pawn structure to withstand such advances. A knight now arrives at b6, eyeing the c4 outpost and offering to redeploy to the queen's flank, potentially reinforcing the pawn chain or finding a more active square like a4 or c4. An audacious knight hop, seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queen side and perhaps exploit any weaknesses around the king's flank. It aims to create immediate tactical headaches by targeting squares like f7 and g6, forcing black to react decisively. Black consolidates the knight's central aspiration by repositioning the bishop, establishing a more robust defensive posture around the king while simultaneously preparing to contest the open c-file, aiming to disrupt white's burgeoning queenside pressure and perhaps exploit the weakened pawn structure that resulted from the earlier exchange. White aims to shatter black's central pawn structure and create open lines for their pieces. Unleashing the king's pawn with a forward thrust aims to disrupt white's knight outpost and challenge its central control, though it does create a lingering structural weakness on the king side that might be exploited later. The knight retreats, seeking a more harmonious placement after its ambitious excursion. This repositioning aims to regain influence over the central squares, specifically the d5 and e4 outposts, and prepares to support a potential pawn advance on the king side should black's defense falter. Observe how white's seemingly passive maneuver still contributes to the subtle struggle for control of key territories and prepares the ground for future piece activity. Embracing the open file, black decisively cracks open the queenside pawn structure to initiate counterplay. White is actively seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure by opening the d-file. This capture, while seemingly straightforward, forces black to make a decision regarding their c4 pawn, potentially leading to a more open position where white's pieces can find better activity. Consider how this exchange might impact the central pawn tension and the future development of black's queenside. A strategic repositioning unfolds as the knight vacates the central squares, seeking an active role on the queenside, aiming to bolster the pawn structure and potentially challenge white's control of the open c-file. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside, white seeks to disrupt black's compact setup and potentially open lines for attack against the isolated c-pawn. The knight's journey to e7 aims to support the pawn push on f5, a critical objective to break open lines towards white's king and potentially challenge the dominant knight on g5. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, is a crucial piece of preparation, building a foundation for future offensive action on the king side. Initiating a pawn storm on the queen side is now a key objective, and this knight's repositioning directly supports that endeavor by preparing for a potential advance. Initiating a bold exchange, black aims to dismantle white's central control and open lines for their pieces. This isn't just a knight for a knight swap, it's a strategic gambit to reshape the pawn structure, potentially liberating the queen's bishop and creating dynamic possibilities on the queen side. The knight's departure from d5 vacates a crucial outpost, and black hopes to exploit the ensuing imbalances. Unlocking the d-file opens a direct assault, leveraging the pawn's new dominion and threatening to disrupt black's meticulously constructed pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing for potential breakthroughs against the weakened kingside. Black boldly throws a pawn forward, a dramatic bid to shatter white's central pawn structure and open attacking avenues for the queen and knight. This aggressive pawn thrust, while seemingly ambitious, risks overextending black's forces and creating weaknesses on the dark squares, particularly if white can exploit the advanced pawn's isolation. It's a double-edged sword, designed to disrupt white's harmony and create dynamism, but it demands precise follow-up play to justify the structural concessions. Pivoting the knight to the kingside opens avenues for potential kingside attack or a regrouping maneuver to a more active square like f4, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially target the weak c5 square. Black boldly challenges the center and seeks to activate their pieces. This move carves open lines for potential queenside play and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, particularly at d5. Consider the long-term implications of this pawn push for piece development and control of the critical e4 square. Initiating a rook to the open e-file, this maneuver signals a fundamental shift, aiming to occupy and exert pressure along a crucial pathway that directly confronts black's castled king and the recently advanced pawn chain. It's a proactive assertion of central influence, potentially setting the stage for a more direct assault or a strategic exchange aimed at simplifying the position to white's advantage. The rook's repositioning also frees up the other rook to potentially join the action or defend key squares, offering a flexible approach to the unfolding middle game struggle. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside, 23. Qg6 initiates a potent psychological and physical pressure, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed white monarch and the potential for battery formation along the g-file. Striking at the center with f4 immediately confronts black's pawn chain, aiming to shatter its integrity and potentially open lines for white's pieces. This aggressive pawn thrust could liberate the knight on d2 and the bishop on d2, while simultaneously challenging black's central control and attempting to restrict the activity of their pieces. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative and create imbalances, but it also carries risks, potentially weakening white's kingside and creating targets if not supported properly. Unleashing a central pawn thrust at last, this move forces an immediate reckoning with white's exposed king, potentially opening a crucial diagonal for the queen or bishop and disrupting the harmony of white's forces, all while black's knight at e7 now finds a much more active square on f3, contributing to the looming tactical storm and challenging the very fabric of white's pawn structure. Initiating a knight reroute through the kingside aims to bolster the center and potentially pressure black's queenside pawn chain. Unlocking the central files becomes the immediate imperative for black, as the pawn structure, particularly on the d-file, is ripe for exploitation. The rook now ventures into the heart of the battlefield, aiming to reinforce the advanced e-pawn and potentially contest control of the open d-file, disrupting white's ambitious central pawn advances and forcing a reassessment of white's knight positioning. This repositioning of the queen to the center of the action, specifically the d3 square, aims to liberate the g3 pawn, creating immediate pressure on black's kingside and preparing for a potential pawn storm, while also offering a safe haven for the queen should the f-file become too hot. This maneuver activates the rook to a more central file, seeking to create counterplay against white's potentially exposed king, while simultaneously eyeing the pawn on d5. The bishop retreats to an active diagonal, aiming to support the central pawns and contest the open c-file that might arise. This repositioning of the bishop is a subtle attempt to improve white's piece coordination, looking for opportunities to activate its latent power. It might also be a preparatory move for a potential queenside expansion or a way to bring more pressure onto black's king position. Observe how white is trying to build a more cohesive structure, where each piece has a clear objective and contributes to the overall plan. Reclaiming central influence and preparing a swift strike toward the weakened kingside, this move sacrifices immediate pawn tension for dynamic possibilities. Realigning the queen to the center of operations aims to pressure black's potentially exposed king and consolidate white's queenside influence. Repositioning the rook to the central file aims to activate it, challenging white's control and potentially opening lines for future action, while also preparing to contest the open e-file that has become a focal point. A daring attempt to disrupt black's coordination by forcing the queen onto a less active square, though it risks creating weaknesses. Disrupting the aggressive pawn chain, black reclaims initiative on the king side, aiming to untangle their pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay against white's advanced central pawns. Sacrificing the queen here, white intentionally transitions to a simplified, potentially advantageous endgame. By removing the immediate attacking threat from black's queen, white aims to exploit the exposed nature of the black king and the potentially weak pawn structure that might arise. This bold queen trade offers a dynamic shift, turning the game into a strategic battle of maneuvering minor pieces and king activity rather than a sharp tactical slugfest. A bold gambit for material control, accepting a doubled pawn structure for the potential of greater piece activity on the open files, though it does leave your king with a slightly more porous defense. Opening the d-file is a vital strategic pivot, aiming to bring the rook into a more active position and potentially create pressure along the central column. Sensing a potential for an open file attack, black pushes the rook to the second rank, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and create attacking opportunities on the open e-file. Initiating a critical redeployment, the bishop pivots, aiming to bolster the besieged queenside pawns and potentially influence the e-file, a welcome shift from its passive placement on d2. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal, but the immediate spatial pressure on the queenside, particularly from white's queen and rook, continues to be a significant concern for black's pawn structure. Pondering the blocked central pawn chain, this thrust aims to dislodge black's knight and possibly activate the rook to the open f-file, creating immediate offensive potential and addressing white's previously passive rook. Unleashing a pawn storm in front of the king often signals an aggressive intent to disrupt white's seemingly solid defenses. Abandoning the rook on the 7th rank allows the black king a dangerous central escape route, potentially opening a path for the queen to exploit vulnerabilities. Reclaiming the rook's mobility is paramount after white's queen maneuver, aiming to exploit the now open e-file and reactivate the bishop on g3. Recapturing on d2 seems like a reactive choice, prioritizing pawn structure over active piece play, and effectively conceding the central open file without a fight, which might allow black's rooks to become more menacing. Retrieving the rook from its advanced post, black seeks to reinforce the central control and prepare for potential counterplay, aiming to reposition this crucial piece to a more active square. Shifting the bishop to the fianchetto square now aims to prepare for a potential redeployment, possibly to g3, to exert pressure along the newly opened diagonal. Unleashing the kingside pawns, this aggressive advance creates immediate chaos and opens lines towards white's monarch, forcing a reaction to the encroaching storm. Unlocking the h-file creates an immediate dilemma for black's g-pawn, forcing a decision that will either solidify white's attacking pressure or create weaknesses. The pawn thrust opens up a critical diagonal for the bishop, creating immediate attacking potential against the exposed white king and potentially creating a passed pawn on the h-file. Shifting the knight to the e1 square, an unassuming repositioning, aims to redeploy that piece to a more active role, perhaps by swinging it over to the kingside to support a future advance or even to participate in a potential kingside attack, a welcome change from its previous passive placement. Unleashing the pawn spearhead offers a dramatic pawn breakthrough, aiming to shatter white's defensive structure and expose their king to immediate danger through the now open g-file.